So welcome everybody. We've got a very interesting guest this afternoon to talk to us, and her name is Margaret Kenna, and she has done she's had a lifetime relationship with a very particular island in Greek island called Anafi. Anafi. I probably pronounced that wrong.
Fine, that's fine.
Okay, as an anthropologist. So we had a chat beforehand to talk about this. She sent me a couple of papers that she's written. She's obviously an academic, and I read both of those papers in order to...
There'll be a test afterwards.
Well, try me, because I think I can remember most of it. It's quite recent in my memory. I was doing it this morning. And they are fascinating papers. I was really pleased to read them because I was very interested in what she's been doing, what she's got to say. And as I said, this is a lifetime endeavour for her, which started back in the 1960s. So the first question is a very general one, actually, Margaret, and it's for the benefit of anybody that is on this call who would have been as unsure as I was when I first spoke to you. What does anthropology seek to do as a study? Just give us a general overview of what anthropology is and what it seeks to do.
Okay, sociology tends to be the study of modern Western industrialized society by people from that society. That's a very broad brush definition. Anthropology started off as being the study of so-called other cultures. I'm really into lecturing mode now because I can feel my hands starting to move. People in other societies by people from Western societies. One of the first people I was born in Australia. A lot of the very early studies were of so-called Australian Aborigines, native Australians, nearly always by men, very often by men who were out there because, say, their parents were missionaries or something, trying to Christianize. Anyway, they were interested in the differences and similarities between cultures and society, between the roles of men and the roles of women in these small-scale societies, making very broad brush kind of generalizations about, the men will hunt and the women will gather and the women will look after the children and so on. And then all of that sort of got blown apart because they found women were hunting and men were looking after children. And that sort of began to disturb things a bit. And it also got tied up with ideas of, Western civilization being superior. And then all sorts of ideas about maybe it wasn't after all. Maybe it wasn't like that. Maybe there were lots to look for in other societies that was different. Then you get an interesting reversal, which is people from other cultures coming to study Britain and say, aren't they peculiar? Well, like the Greek student I mentioned, you mean to say there's more than one kind of Protestantism?
Yeah, yes, you don't realise when you live in a society what the oddities might be for somebody visiting you, and that's what the anthropologist seeks to do, to visit another country and then have a look at what's going on there, to compare and contrast, perhaps. That's now, right. You landed in the 1960s as a single, quite young postdoc student. I
wasn't even a postdoc. I was writing, getting ready to collect material for a doctorate then.
For your thesis.
Yeah,
okay. And you landed on this island.
I didn't.
Oh.
I chose an island the previous summer. I went to that island and there was somebody else there. Okay. So it's like Robinson Crusoe finding another Robinson Crusoe there and saying, oh, this isn't my story at all. So the man who wrote wills or drafted dowry agreements for people on that island said, well, I sometimes go to this other little island called Anafi, and there's a cafe there that has a room below with a lovely terrace and a view, and I always stay there when I go. Why don't you give that a try? And I thought, okay, I'll do that. So it was all by chance. I wrote a letter to my parents saying, this is not I'm a field worker with no field. I haven't got anywhere to go. What am I supposed to do? So it was like I was in the depths of despair, and then I arrived on Anafi, and that was
the rest is history.
The rest is my life's work. So I was 24 then, I'm 79 now, and I've seen the island change, and I've got involved with the migrants and so on, and then tourism comes.
Yeah, well, let's go back to the 1960s because you landed on this island. You know, it wasn't the one that you first were going to, but you ended up there. That was fate, presumably. Fate would have it that you went to Anafi. And tell us a little bit about what this island was like in the 1960s. You know, what was its size, the population, what were the things that economically were important there, and so on and so forth. Just give us a sketch of it in the 1960s.
Well, there were maybe about fewer than 200 people living there at that point. Nearly all the able-bodied young men and mature men were going to Athens to work on the buildings, and there was a great deal of post-war reconstruction. So you were talking about, say, the mid-60s, but there was Greece was occupied by the Nazis and some Italian forces, and there was a great deal of destruction. You may not know that Oxfam was founded in Oxford because there was a huge famine in Greece, because the Nazis were taking all the Greek subsistence materials away. People were dying in the streets of Athens from starvation, particularly people working in banks and civil servants, because they didn't have anything else except cash to keep them going. And people went back to the countryside, and then once the war was over and reconstruction began, they left the countryside in droves to help reconstruction. So the island was depopulating. So it was basically women, small children, elderly people, and men who didn't want to go to the city or couldn't for various reasons. And I thought, you know, this is going to be a picture of a society that's dying. No electricity. The doctor was only there during the summer. So I thought I should have had my appendix out before I came, just in case something happens. And there was only one sit-down toilet on the island. Everything else was either those what used to be called Turkish toilets, the ones with foot plates that you crouched on, or else you went in a hen house. So one of my early stories is how a hen pecked my bottom, because I said, I have to go to the loo. Well, you have to go in there. And while I was in there, a hen went and pecked my bottom. So, wow. You know, you have to put up with all sorts of indignities, you know, when you're doing work like that.
You're painting a picture of a society that is slowly losing its strong young men to Athens and the building sites. So in that sense, could be seen to be declining and dying.
And the young women were also leaving, many of them to work as maids or child carers in the houses of people in the city, because they didn't want to stay on an island where basically for women, life was grinding in terms of all the washing had to be done by hand, all the water had to be pulled up, you know, with a bucket and rope. But I suppose anybody, any super trooper who lived, you know, in a Welsh village 50 years ago or in a Scottish village would know that kind of life. Very, very hard work for women.
Actually, my grandmother lived in a village or a small town in Norfolk, and I can remember she had a copper and a well. No running water and no toilet indoors. So we're talking about this being very primitive. In fact, that would have been Norfolk in the 1930s, and that was pretty primitive there as well. So you had this experience, in fact, of a certain culture clash, because you were there to do this research. So that would make you fairly suspect anyway, and you were an outsider. You said sort of like evening school Greek.
Until I learned peasant Greek.
Yes.
And when I went to Athens, one of my friends said to me, please don't talk to my parents in Greek till they know you a bit better, because they will never believe that you're from a university with that accent.
That's layers of snobbery there.
It's very much e by gum, if you like,
yeah.
in that sense, or
but
I think better like boy if you're from Norfolk.
Tell us a little bit about what, as I say, some of that cultural clash that went on when you arrived as this quite young and fairly naive 24-year-old.
Yes. Well, I was asking various kinds of questions, and I was told later that those are the kind of questions that people who are interested in tax ask. How much land have you got? You know, what, not exactly what is your income, but you know, how much flour do your fields produce, or how much olive oil do you get from your trees? So there was a suspicion on that hand. The big breakthrough, well, not breakthrough, but illumination for me was one day I was sitting in somebody's kitchen, and the woman's baby started to cry, and she was busy, so I picked up the baby and was sort of comforting it, and she said, I would never have let you touch my child 3 months ago, because we all thought you were a kaki gineka, a bad woman. Why? Because you sit with your legs crossed at the knee. And I said, what? Yeah, why? It twists up the womb. It prevents conception. Only prostitutes sit like that. So all the time I was saying, here I am, you know, an academic wanting to get my degree. They were saying, oh no, she isn't. Look at the way she's sitting.
Yeah. I think that's really, really interesting, because it just goes to show how you come from as an outsider into a society, and they will make judgments of you. You have no idea that they're making those judgments on the tiniest thing, like a little tiny part of body language, and they make all these assumptions. I mean, you could say that it was an extremely traditional society in the sense of women's roles, men's roles, and so on. So there were issues for you there also about the fact that you were female, and that you were asking questions, you know, and trying to meet and talk to men, but that wasn't acceptable, even in a cafe in public.
Well, whenever I spoke to a man, he would raise his voice, so I could never ask questions in a cafe. I didn't realize till afterwards he was trying to protect my reputation as much as his own, because he was replying to me so that everybody could hear that we weren't making a secret assignation, given the idea that I might have had other money-making attributes in mind.
I mean, all of this is very amusing, but at the same time, you know, for you were there, you know, day to day, trying to gather this information. So these were real barriers, actually, to what you were trying to do. You then you got these, you know, enough information for you to write your thesis, for you to then get your PhD. I think you then got married, and you did return in the 1970s when you were married, but you still had no child at that point. And again, they were quite horrified by that, weren't they? They were worried about you.
You'd been married 3 years. I'd lost weight, because when I was there, I was quite a chunky young woman, and I suppose comfort eating, something like that, you know, and I'd lost weight. So in Greece, you tend to gain weight when you're married, because you're cooking for yourself and you can eat what you want, or you're cooking for your family and you can eat what you want. And they took me aside and said, is he not treating you right? Why aren't you pregnant? And then I began to get all sorts of information that I hadn't been able to get when I was unmarried. So it changed things enormously. And by then, things were beginning to change very slightly on the island, that some people were seeing that other islands were developing, and they were hoping that their own island might have some potential, but it didn't get electricity for 5 years after that visit in the 70s. But I think they knew that the plans were there to produce a generator. And that's what
so things were becoming a bit more hopeful. And then in the 1980s, you had a child by then. You went back there, and this time, instead of people leaving, people were returning. Is that right? So tell us a little bit about the 1980s and how Anafi had changed.
By that time, it had electricity. Although there wasn't an actual road, you could get refrigerators, albeit on the back of a donkey, up from the harbour to the village, and television sets. So, you know, a cafe would have a television set usually. Oh, and the priest would come in, particularly when Fame was on. Everybody, they said he likes Lassie and he likes Fame, those two television programs. He'd always come in to watch those. So they were able to sell cold drinks, to bring in frozen food, and so on, which they hadn't been able to do before. So that was one aspect. And as I said, the electricity made life much easier for women, because you didn't have storage problems anymore. And some women actually had washing machines.
Wow. Did they have toilets?
They were now beginning to have proper toilets. And then a bit later on, there was running water.
Wow. I mean, and this is the 1980s, you know, we must remind ourselves, this is quite, you know, the 1980s to me, and anyway, it's the very recent past. So again, you're still studying this place. What I found quite interesting from the papers that I read this morning that you've written is the way that you changed over that time as well. So you became much more enlightened in a lot of way through what you call feminist anthropology, the understanding, the greater understanding of the field that you actually work within. So tell us a little bit about that, how you brought a different take on things by the 1980s.
Well, if I can just say something about women anthropologists, I think if anybody thinks of a woman anthropologist, they probably think of Margaret Mead.
Yes, that's right. That's the only one I know.
Yeah, coming of age in Samoa and things like that. And by the way, she's the reason why I kept my birth surname as my professional name, because she said husbands come and go.
Oh, right.
A nice way of putting it, but I'm going to stick to my surname. And when I said this at Swansea at the university, and I said I'm sticking to this as my professional name, they said, well, that's very odd. And I said, well, Elizabeth Taylor didn't change to be Elizabeth Burton in the films when she married Richard Burton, of him being a Welshman, of course. I thought that would be very appropriate. There's all the difference in the world between you and Elizabeth Taylor. So that was, I mean, and we're talking about, that was when I got married, so that's the 70s. No, what women anthropologists, there were some, but they had enormous difficulties. Very often there would be a married couple who did research together. And I think one of your pieces about stereotypes of women mention, I think, a film in which it turns out that the wife has been the author of her Oscar-winning husband's, not Oscar, a Nobel Prize winner, right? Well, an enormous number of husband and wife teams. The wife did, 50% of the work, if not more, and particularly establishing her husband as a safe person, because he brought his wife there and he wasn't there to seduce local women and so on. And the story I think I told in one of my answers to your thing was in Greece, there was an anthropologist who'd taken his wife, and he was getting absolutely nowhere. And then at one point, village boys started beating up a little shepherd boy, and his wife took the boy home and cleaned him up and put bandages on, and off he ran. And that evening, one of the shepherd women came to their house in the village and yanked them by the hand and said, "Come with me." And they went to the shepherd's village for a full-on feast. And so she was the one, she was the gateway for her husband into that society, and she talked to women. So when he writes the book and gets the PhD, it's basically half of it was hers. But she didn't get a PhD. She, you know, and whereas now, if a husband and wife team go into the field together, she writes hers and he writes his.
Yeah, it was ever thus, Margaret. I mean, that story kind of echoes of that story all over the place.
All over, yeah. Behind every great man, there's a great woman, sort of thing. Yes,
absolutely. So, what else? Yeah, let's bring it up to date. So, you are now some kind of honorary member or something of Anafi. Tell us a little bit about now.
Well, when they said we want to make you an honorary citizen, I said, "Does that mean I can vote?" "Oh no!" Immediately down again. Well, the island is now being marketed. If you go online and look for it, you know, a totally unspoiled island, which is a bit like, you know, Norfolk, idyllic Norfolk, you know. And you would say, "Oh, you should have seen it when there was an outside toilet." This is like, well, I knew it when it was really unspoiled. The cafes didn't open in the middle of the day because there weren't any men there to drink coffee in the cafes, because the few men who were there were out working in the fields. So there's been a terrific change. There's been beach culture, illegal camping on the beaches all along the south coast. And there are only 2 policemen. So, you know, they could only arrest 2 people at a time because the cell in the police station is only big enough for 2 people. So, you know, if you've got 150 young people in tents on a beach, or even 250, you can't just round them all off and send them off on the next boat. So, you know, that's the way a lot of money is made. They come into the village, they buy things, they go back out, and every spring there's a big concerted effort to clear all the plastic waste from all the different beaches. So the whole style of the island has changed, with the beach dwellers on one hand and the ones who feel they're part of the village. Some of them are living, or well, some people are actually living on the island, of either renting or bought property there, and other people are come every year for 2 or 3 months to the same set of rooms, and each time they leave, a bit like you maybe with your if you hadn't had your place in France and you had been renting, you would have said same time next year and gone back in those same months. And that's what they do at the end of the season. They say, "See you next year."
And 2 questions. What's the population now, would you say? And also,
that's also a difficult question to answer, because the voting register gives a number, but not all those people are there on the island all the time.
Right.
So I'd say there's probably more like 250 to 290 people living there more or less permanently. But a large number of people leave, let's say, at the end of November and go to Athens and central heating for November, December, January, February, and come back in March, April. So they're really there 9 months of the year, even though they're permanent residents.
And do you still go back every year? And are there people?
I haven't been able to.
No, but you know, will you go back when you can? And the other question is, are there still people there that you knew in the 1960s?
Yes, there are still people I knew, though the women I talked to when I was 24, who might have been in their 40s or 50s, I'm afraid a lot of those old friends have died in the meantime. oh yes, there's a lot I could say about that, but anyway, there are women who come up to me and say, don't you remember me? And it was a little girl when I knew that person, so I don't recognize her as a mature woman. And she would say, I'm in that photo with you there. And then I'd say, oh yes, you're Urania, or whatever her name was. And I have to sort of see that child in that woman's face and sort of re-establish the relationship that way.
And would you say that Anafi now is a thriving community rather than a dying community? You know,
oh, it's definitely thriving. Yes, yeah. Yes. But I mean, two things are. One is tourism, and the other is roads. The roads have taken. There are asphalted roads, and there are what they call agricultural roads, which are dirt roads, and people have bought quad bikes and go out to the fields, and they've reopened the land that they abandoned for tourism, because in those days, before there were the agricultural road, it would take you 2 or 3 hours with a donkey to get out to your field, and it simply wasn't economically worth it. So that garden land and so on just declined. I mean, it's very biblical in one sense, because it's the people who used to have the agricultural land and could afford to have laborers suddenly find they couldn't get laborers anymore, because the laborers who'd inherited maybe what previously had been thought of as poor land by the sea now were the ones who are building, holiday villas and making the money. So, the roles were reversed. The people who had the land inland couldn't get laborers, and now people can grow their fresh vegetables for the tourist trade, for the restaurants and so on. So things are picking up a great deal.
That's nice to hear, really nice to hear. It's because the dying of those communities is so sad, and the loss of all that tradition and so on. So my final question to you is the main themes in your initial research, which were to do with how children were named, what dowries would be given to daughters, and how families estates were divided and so on and so forth. So these traditions around inheritance and naming and so on and so forth, which was the original study that you did, has all of that gone by the by?
Oh no, people still name their children in that pattern. But even when I was there, it was beginning to alter, because women would have had a dowry house on the island, and it became much more important for a woman to have a flat in Athens.
Okay.
And also, if a son inherited land from his father, he might not want one of these nice fields inland. What he'd rather have would be a seaside bit where he could build a holiday villa. So that was important. What has continued, which I was going to say about when you reminded me, as it were, of my old friends dying off, although, as it were, the outside forms have changed, the important thing is to carry out these rituals for the fate of the soul. Whether or not you believe in this, it's very important to be seen to be doing it. So you carry out these rituals. A very important one is 40 days after somebody's died. And this is so much part of Greek culture that employers will allow their employees time off to go for the 40-day not celebration, but commemoration. Mm-hmm. And then they're at different intervals. And it used to be the case that the bones would be exhumed and washed in wine and then put in a bone depository, either in a box in the cemetery there or in a chapel on family land. That still happens.
Wow.
It still happens.
Yeah.
But I was told this is terrible because it used to be wooden coffins in the soil and people wrapped in organic fabric, cloth. You now get laminated wooden coffins which won't rot properly, and bodies wrapped up in polyester cotton sheets, which also won't rot properly. So things aren't as they should be. And I won't make everybody's stomach turn by saying, but it's not as it used to be. You're not pulling up, as it were, clean bones from these graves anymore.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. That's fantastic, Margaret. So that's absolutely fascinating. I love that, the story of your life, really, with this.
One more bit you haven't covered.
Go on then.
And that is at the end of the 80s, just at the end of this year's research between the island and the migrants. So I was known by both sets of people. One family said to me, and that was the family of the man who'd been my landlord, with what I said, there was the cafe with the view,
Yeah.
He'd cooked for me and so on. There are the things of his you might like to see. And there was a box with the shadow puppets that he had used to entertain people. And below the shadow puppets were 160 glass negatives dating from the mid-1930s to the beginning of the 1940s, showing the life of a commune of political exiles who'd been put on the island by the authorities. They might have been communists, they might have been left-wing, they might have been there because a rival for village politics said, oh, he bought the equivalent of the Morning Star, communist left-wing newspaper, and you were sent into exile because you were dangerous for the body politic. And that just changed the next 10 years of research for me. I started researching the past, where the what was happening with these political exiles, and some of them were women.
Yeah.
It's all to do with trades unionism as well.
Yes.
People who were involved in trades unions,
yeah,
and the organisers of these places were sent into exile. So
yeah. I read your paper this morning on that, and it was a fascinating, it's fascinating because of the way that they were exiled, and also how they could live out and that they were communists, so therefore setting up in exile, they were left to their own devices, given 10 drachma a day, which is very little money.
Even then it was very little.
They were prisoners.
The organisers.
But they were left to their own devices, and they ended up sort of setting up what were effectively communes, because they could then live out their political ideology in real terms. So let's go to Emily and see if you've got any questions there, Emily.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions, both from June. Margaret, June first asks, did you marry a Greek?
No. But my research put me in touch with somebody who had very compatible interests. I married somebody who's a historian of classical education. His name is Christopher Stray, and he's written something like 52 books. So, I've only written 2. So there we are. But yes, if it hadn't been for what I'd done, somebody else who knew us said, I think you might like to meet this person. And it was the lightning bolt from the sky, as the Greeks say.
Coup de foudre, as they say in France.
As they say in French, yes.
Yeah, nice to have a coup de foudre and then marry him.
And 50 plus years on, we're still together. And under lockdown, we've managed to remain compatible.
Good. That's lovely to hear. And what about your son?
Our son, is a filmmaker, and he made a film called Canaries, which was mostly filmed in a place called Lower Cwmtwch, which is in South Wales, and is about aliens coming to Wales. So
sounds interesting.
yes, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Any other questions, Emily?
Yeah, June also asked, where are you living now, Margaret?
I live in Swansea. I live in a suburb of Swansea called Uplands, which is very near Cumdonkin Park, where Dylan Thomas used to play as a boy. So very literary, and very nice for us during lockdown, because we could go and walk in Cumdonkin Park, and remain sort of elderly vulnerables, or whatever is the category. And we've got people in the flat above who, until we could get on the list for doing things, getting deliveries, used to get stuff from supermarkets for us. So we've been very, very lucky in that respect.
Very well looked after in your community, obviously, which is really nice.
Yeah.
That's lovely. Any more, Emily? That's it.
That's it, thank you.
Okay, Margaret, thank you so much. The women that were in my group with me for your talk, enjoyed it very much. Thought it was an incredibly interesting talk. So you've elucidated us considerably about the whole subject of both anthropology and Anafi, which is fascinating. And I'm thinking I'd quite like to go there.
Well, I said you can go and have a very, very comfortable place. In fact, there is a place that has a jacuzzi in their honeymoon suite.
Gosh.
So if you fancy something really upmarket, it will go that far. Also, I want to thank you for introducing us to Tulali.
We talked about Tulali too, how we were all Tulallied out, and I did say I'm not on commission for Tulali.
No,
yeah.
no,
I think their business has been boosted about 3,00000% since I started to talk about my own Tulali earring. But we all love the fact that you were wearing your Tulalis. Yeah.
Go with my blue and white, being very Greek.
Absolutely perfect combination, Margaret. Just look great. Really lovely. Anyway, I might get in touch with you at some time if I fancy going somewhere like Anafi. How do you get there? Do you fly to, where do you fly to, and then where?
If you fly to Athens, then you go to Piraeus and get a boat.
Yeah.
You can get a cabin, which we do now. I used to sleep on the deck in a sleeping bag in the old days. Or you can fly to Santorini, and then you can get a small boat across. But the worst time in my life, the time which was worse than chemotherapy, was on a small boat between Santorini and Anafi. I really wanted to die then.
Yeah.
And so whenever I feel awful, I think, remember, it wasn't as bad as being on that boat then.
That's not a very good recommendation, I have to say.
Well, that was a fishing boat. We're talking about the 60s. I mean, now they've got, motor cruisers and things like that, and you can sit on a bench, and they've got a bar with iced orangeade and things like that. No, it was me lying there with dead fish washing around my feet and that kind of thing. Don't
go there. The smell. Oh, the smell. Yes. Okay. On that note.
With the odor of fish. Yes.
On that note, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming to listen this afternoon. It'll all be on YouTube, as we said. But
I hope I haven't been in seminar mode too much.
Not at all. Not at all. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and a great delight to have your company. Thank you, Margaret, and thank you everybody for joining us. Bye bye, everybody.